The start of a terrifying crime spree. It was a cold, misty autumn evening in late September of 1997 when the small, peaceful town of Green Lake, Michigan, first began to feel the tremors of an unseen evil. Nestled on the outskirts of Detroit, Green Lake was known for its quiet streets, wooden houses with white picket fences, and a tightly knit community that had always prided itself on being safe and welcoming. But all of that would change in just a few short months. The first signs appeared innocuously enough, a news headline noting the peculiar disappearance of a local waitress named Emily Carter. At 22, Emily was bright-eyed and full of life, known by many in town as the girl with the golden laugh. Emily had last been seen leaving her late-night shift at the town's diner, her warm smile lighting up the gloom of dusk as she waved goodbye to her co-workers. She never made it home. Her disappearance stunned the locals. It was uncharacteristic for Emily to drop off the radar without so much as a goodbye, and the police were quick to organize search parties. Volunteers combed through nearby forests, rivers, and back roads, their flashlights flickering in the crisp Michigan air, but there was little to find. That was until 2 days later, when a hiker stumbled upon her lifeless body in a woodland clearing about 6 miles outside of town. Emily's death wasn't just tragic, it was gruesome. The condition of her body was so shocking that even battle-hardened detectives were rendered speechless. Evidence suggested Emily had been subjected to brutal violence before she died, her body positioned in a way that almost seemed ritualistic. It was clear, this was not just a random act of violence, this was personal. Green Lake was no stranger to its fair share of disturbances over the years, bar fights, petty theft, small-time vandalism, but something like this? It was unheard of. The sheer brutality of the crime planted a deep unease in the hearts of Green Lake's residents, forcing them to reconsider the comforting assumption that their little town was immune to the darkness of the world. The police immediately launched an intensive investigation, calling in reinforcements from the state and even the FBI. News vans began arriving, reporters descending upon the town and bringing with them the blinding glare of cameras and sensational headlines. "Small-town killer strikes Green Lake," the papers declared. Neighbors locked their doors for the first time in decades, businesses shortened their nighttime hours, and parents refused to let their children roam the streets after sundown. Despite the media frenzy and the fear gripping the town, no leads emerged. The gruesome details of Emily's death were kept confidential, but rumors spread like wildfire. One day, you'd hear whispers about a drifter seen downtown. The next, someone swore it was a disgruntled ex-lover. That was the thing about Green Lake. Everyone knew everyone, and with that knowledge came suspicion. The townspeople were searching for a face to blame, a personification of the nightmare that had crept into their idyllic lives. Weeks passed, and then months, without any new developments. But just as the town began to gingerly ease into a semblance of normalcy, the killer struck again. This time, the victim was Sarah Carlisle, a 27-year-old librarian. Her body was discovered near the edge of a jogging trail, and again the crime scene painted a picture of deliberate malice. The town's sense of safety shattered for good. The realization began to sink in. This wasn't random. There was a pattern here, a predator on the loose. Green Lake became a town on edge, paralyzed by a shared paranoia that felt both oppressive and exhausting. Security systems were hastily installed, people stopped jogging in the park, and local gun shops reported record sales as residents armed themselves for protection. Through it all, one question loomed large. Who could possibly be capable of such calculated cruelty? The unsettling truth would take an entire year to unravel, leaving in its wake a story of betrayal, broken families, and the chilling reality that monsters don't always hide in the dark, they live among us. The first victim and the shattering of a safe community. Emily Carter had grown up in Green Lake, Michigan, a town so small that everyone seemingly knew everyone else. She was the kind of person who would light up a room just by walking into it. At 22, she worked as a waitress at Maggie's Diner, a local landmark where farmers, factory workers, and shop owners gathered to eat breakfast or nurse a cup of coffee well into the afternoon. Emily wasn't rich, her life wasn't particularly remarkable, but there was something magnetic about her, something pure. Her laugh was infectious, her kindness genuine. She was known to offer free meals to those who couldn't afford them, and stayed late to help her coworkers clean up after the dinner rush. On the evening of September 15, 1997, Emily left her shift at Maggie's just a little after 10:30 p.m. It had been a long night, but nothing out of the ordinary. She waved goodbye to her co-workers, the strap of her worn leather purse slung across her shoulder, and stepped out into the cool night. The streets were quiet as they always were at that time. Her apartment was only an 8-minute walk away, a route Emily had taken uncountable times before, but that night she would never make it home. When Emily didn't show up for her morning shift the next day, her manager, Maggie herself, grew worried. Emily was reliable to a fault. She never no-showed without at least a phone call. Maggie called her apartment, but there was no answer. By midday, word began to spread. Her co-workers started asking around, calling friends and family, but no one had seen or heard from her since the previous night. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, Green Lake was abuzz with worry. Groups of locals organized impromptu search parties. They split into pairs and began scouring every corner of the small town, its alleys, its quiet streets, its wooded edges. Flashlights cut through the darkness as friends, neighbors, and near strangers called Emily's name into the night, their voices tinged with growing desperation. For 2 days it felt like the entire town was holding its breath. Volunteers searched the nearby woods at dawn. Church groups lit candles and said prayers. Parents held their children closer. The sheriff and his deputies, who had dealt mostly with minor infractions like shoplifting or speeding tickets, suddenly found themselves at the center of what was shaping up to be the gravest case in Green Lake's history. Then on the morning of September 17th, the unthinkable happened. A local hiker, an elderly man out with his Labrador retriever, stumbled across something, or rather someone. Lying in a clearing deep in the woods, partially obscured by leaves and damp earth, was a body. It was only when he got closer that the full horror hit him. It was Emily. She was dead. The man fumbled for his cell phone but found his hands trembling too much to dial. He flagged down a passing cyclist who called the police. When officers arrived, they immediately secured the area and began their investigation. But Green Lake wasn't prepared for a crime scene like this one. Emily's body showed clear signs of a violent struggle. She'd been bound, assaulted, and subjected to unimaginable cruelty. Her remains bore marks of what appeared to be symbolic positioning, a gruesome tableau that defied comprehension. The news spread like wildfire. By the evening, the details might have been kept from the public, but the mere knowledge that Emily Carter had been found dead was enough to send shockwaves through the tight-knit community. Murmurs filled the crowded aisles of Ben's Grocery. At the church, Pastor Henry was asked to include Emily in the evening vigil. Parents who had always let their kids roam freely now refused to let them out of the house. For a community as small and insulated as Green Lake, the death of one of their own was more than just a tragedy. It was a violation of the unspoken contract they all believed in, that their town was a sanctuary. The people of Green Lake had always taken comfort in the quiet rhythms of their small-town life. They went to baseball games and potlucks. They greeted each other warmly at the post office. Crime was something that happened out there, somewhere far from their front porches and picket fences. But Emily's death shattered that illusion. Investigators worked tirelessly over the following days, but the unsettling truth was this: there were no leads. The crime scene offered precious little evidence. No clear footprints, no weapon, no eyewitnesses. Green Lake's police force, unaccustomed to handling anything beyond a minor burglary, found themselves overwhelmed and out of their depth. As the days turned into weeks, the community's collective grief began to give way to paranoia. Was it someone they knew, a stranger just passing through? Suspicion fell on everyone and no one. Some whispered about the drifter who had been seen loitering near the laundromat a week earlier. Others pointed fingers at Emily's high school ex-boyfriend, a troubled young man who had left a trail of broken promises and bad debts before skipping town. The sheriff's office dismissed these speculations, insisting they were doing all they could. But to the people of Green Lake, official assurances were cold comfort. Their sense of security had been eviscerated, and Emily's death was just the beginning. A pattern of relentless violence and growing boldness. In the wake of Emily Carter's grisly murder, Green Lake was transformed. It went from a community of unlocked doors and nightly strolls to one of drawn curtains, dead-bolted locks, and peering eyes anxiously scanning the shadows. Yet, despite the rampant fear, the town still clung to hope. Hope that Emily's tragic death was an isolated crime, an anomaly in an otherwise safe and predictable existence. That hope would soon be dashed. Just 6 weeks after Emily's body was discovered, another young woman, Sarah Carlisle, went missing. A beloved librarian at Green Lake Public Library, Sarah was known for her warm demeanor and encyclopedic knowledge of classic literature. She was last seen leaving the library late one evening after staying late to finish cataloging a new shipment of books. Co-workers recalled her cheerful goodbye and the sight of her purple scarf fluttering as she walked to her car. But Sarah never made it home. Her body was found 3 days later, near the edge of a jogging trail just outside the town limits. Like Emily, Sarah had been brutally murdered and left in a disturbingly deliberate pose, which authorities deemed too horrific to share with the public. Though details of the autopsy were kept under wraps, whispers began to circulate. This was no opportunistic killing. Law enforcement confirmed one harrowing truth. Sarah Carlisle was the second victim of what appeared to be a cold and calculating serial killer. The similarities between the murders of Emily and Sarah were chilling. Both young women were alone late at night. Both were victims of unimaginable cruelty. And in both cases there were no witnesses, no meaningful forensic evidence, and no apparent motive beyond the sheer malice of the act. Whoever was responsible not only planned their crimes meticulously, but also seemed to take pleasure in toying with the boundaries of morality. The tension in Green Lake began to boil over. Every glance on the street felt suspicious, every unfamiliar face a possible predator. To the community, the killings felt deeply personal, like a betrayal of the sacred trust that small-town life promises, that everyone belongs, that everyone is safe. Yet despite the panic gripping the area, no one realized that the worst was yet to come. The killer struck again 2 months later. This time his victim was Lisa Donahue, a 25-year-old receptionist who had been reported missing after failing to show up to her family's Christmas dinner. Her remains were discovered in a snowy forest clearing just beyond a popular sledding hill frequented by local children. Horror swept through Green Lake as families realized how close the killer had come to the innocent life of the town's youth. By now, a chilling pattern was emerging, one that law enforcement couldn't ignore. Each murder bore hallmarks of meticulous planning combined with a level of depravity that even seasoned detectives found difficult to process. The women were all abducted or attacked at night, their bodies left in isolated outdoor locations, often within a 5 to 10 mile radius of Green Lake. Each scene suggested a deliberate sense of staging, almost as if the killer was leaving a dark message for anyone who discovered his gruesome tableau. The escalation of violence was undeniable. While Emily's murder had been horrific, Lisa's was far more savage, with signs the killer had spent significantly more time with his victim than in previous cases. It wasn't just the brutality that was escalating, it was the boldness. In Emily's case, the killer had chosen a secluded forest road far from town. By the time of Lisa's murder, he left her body near a public hill frequented by droves of families, barely concealing her remains beneath evergreens and snow. With each passing crime it became painfully clear that the killer was growing bolder. Not only was he perfecting his method, but he also seemed to derive a sick sense of satisfaction from the alarm and chaos he was inducing in the community. It was as though the killer was challenging the town, taunting them with his relentless presence, as if to say, "Catch me if you can." The FBI, now fully involved, explored every avenue. They combed through missing persons reports, questioned anyone who might have noticed something suspicious, and even profiled the killer as someone likely living within the community itself. Yet, despite their exhaustive efforts, the killer left behind no definitive trace, no DNA, no clear pattern of victims beyond being young adult women, no connection among the victims that they could discern. By the time the fourth victim, Michelle Green, was found in an abandoned cabin just outside Green Lake, the town was gripped in full-blown hysteria. Residents installed floodlights and home surveillance cameras. Nightly news broadcasts warned women not to walk alone. Local businesses adjusted their hours, ensuring no employee had to leave work in the dark. Yet even with a community on high alert, the killer seemed to remain 2 steps ahead. Police began to piece together the psychological portrait of the person they were hunting. This wasn't just someone acting out of impulse. This killer was deliberate, calculating, and comfortable in their depravity. The seemingly random selection of their victims suggested they didn't choose women based on personal vendettas. It was about the process, the control, and the twisted satisfaction of seeing the community unravel. Each new killing brought waves of media attention. Green Lake became the unlikely epicenter of a macabre national story. Weekly tabloids screamed headlines like, "The Daylight Phantom Strikes Again," while network anchors speculated on air about whether they'd ever see a case this baffling, this evil, solved. Perhaps the most unsettling notion was that, with each report aired, the killer might be watching along with everyone else, reveling in the fear and confusion he had so skillfully orchestrated. As 1998 began, the killer had claimed 4 confirmed victims. but people across Green Lake feared the number would continue to rise unless law enforcement could finally outwit the monster in their midst. The Breakthrough, a survivor's chilling account. For months, the town of Green Lake had been living in the shadow of a faceless predator, gripped by fear, with law enforcement seemingly no closer to finding the person responsible for the string of horrific murders. The constant presence of television crews, the endless speculations on nightly news, and the whispers of neighbors looking over their shoulders had turned the once lively community into a town of locked doors and hushed voices. But everything shifted on the evening of March 3, 1998, when the unimaginable happened. One of his victims got away. Her name was Sarah Klin, a 30-year-old server at a local chain restaurant just off Highway 54. Sarah had recently moved back home to Green Lake after ending a relationship in Chicago that had drained her emotionally and financially. She was trying to rebuild her life, working long hours, saving for a place of her own again, and immersing herself in the quiet familiarity of her hometown. Unfortunately, Sarah's life would soon intersect with a nightmare that would shatter any hopes of normalcy. That evening, Sarah finished her late shift around 10 p.m. and started her drive home in her silver sedan. She lived in a modest duplex on Depot Street only 5 minutes away, but thanks to road construction she was forced to take a slight detour down a dimly lit side street that snaked past the outskirts of a wooded area. It was the kind of road most locals avoided unless they had no other choice. A quiet, eerie stretch of pavement with sparse streetlights and thick trees pressing in from both sides. As she neared the halfway point of the detour, Sarah noticed the unmistakable beam of headlights nearing her from behind. The car was following close enough to make her uneasy. Initially, she thought it might just be another impatient driver frustrated by the detour, but something about how the car moved, pulsing its brakes, staying unnervingly close, began to raise the hairs on the back of her neck. Her rational mind scolded her for being paranoid. After all, what were the odds she'd encounter the killer everyone in Green Lake feared? But then the car behind her accelerated sharply, cutting her off and forcing her to skid to a stop. Her heart hammered as a man stepped out of the vehicle and began approaching her. Thinking quickly, Sarah locked her doors, keeping her hands on the steering wheel as the man moved to her driver's side window, motioning for her to roll it down. He was wearing what looked like a high school team jacket, his hood pulled up and his face partially obscured by the shadows. "Your back tire looks flat," he said, his voice low and oddly calm. "You should check it before you drive any further." Every alarm bell in Sarah's brain went off simultaneously. Something wasn't right. She could tell by his tone that he wasn't there to help, and his insistence that she step out of the car sent terror ricocheting through her chest. She shook her head, muttering a quick, "No thank you," and reached for her phone. Before she could realize what was happening, the man yanked a tire iron from behind his back and smashed her driver's side window, showering her with shards of broken glass. The next moments were a blur of panic and survival instincts. The man reached through the shattered window, grabbing at her arm while Sarah fought back with everything she had. She punched, scratched, and flailed, managing to wrench herself free long enough to scramble out through the passenger side door. Despite her head pounding with adrenaline, she sprinted into the darkness of the trees lining the roadside, zigzagging through the underbrush and praying he wouldn't catch her. The man chased her, yelling threats that chilled her to her core. But Sarah's determination to live proved greater than his grip on control. Just when she thought her lungs would give out, she stumbled into the backyard of a small, dilapidated farmhouse. Miraculously, the porch light was on, and she screamed as loud as she could for help. Moments later, an elderly man with a shotgun emerged from the house, scaring off her attacker. Law enforcement was called immediately. Though shaken and physically bruised, Sarah Klin was alive, and her vivid account of the attack became the most crucial breakthrough in the case to date. For the first time since the killer had emerged, the police had a description: a tall male in his late teens or early 20s, athletic build, wearing what appeared to be a high school athletic jacket. Most importantly, Sarah recalled his voice, gruff and impatient, with a faint nervousness hiding beneath his calm facade. Her account also unveiled another potential key to identifying the killer: his brazen boldness. The fact that he had attacked her on a road that, while dimly lit, was still frequented by occasional traffic suggested he was either growing careless or becoming more confident in his ability to evade capture. The shattered glass, the tire iron, and the marks left on Sarah's car were all collected as evidence. Detectives immediately shifted the focus of their investigation. They began canvassing local high schools and interviewing students and faculty. zeroing in on young males who matched the description provided by Sarah. The FBI profiler added that the suspect likely lived locally, had begun escalating his crimes over time, and might exhibit erratic behavior or withdrawals from his typical social circles. For Sarah, surviving the attack was only the beginning of the nightmare. She struggled with post-traumatic stress, haunted by questions of why she had been targeted and terrified he might come after her again. But what she didn't know at the time was that her ability to escape had fundamentally altered the killer's game. The walls were beginning to close in on him, and for the first time he had left behind more than just a trail of terror. He had left behind evidence. A town gripped by fear, social panic, and desperate measures. The wave of terror that the Green Lake Killer unleashed wasn't limited to his victims, it consumed the entire town. Overnight, the sense of quiet safety that had defined the community shattered, replaced by an overbearing dread that made even the most mundane tasks feel dangerous. The once vibrant streets of Green Lake grew quieter with each passing day, families hunkered down behind locked doors, and neighbors regarded even familiar faces with a newfound suspicion. For decades, Green Lake's residents had prided themselves on their close-knit community. It was the kind of place where kids rode their bikes until the streetlights came on, where unlocked doors were a sign of trust, and where people still waved hello to strangers. But safety had always been an unspoken promise, a promise that now felt irrevocably broken. A shift in daily life. As word of the murders spread and the escalating pattern became clear, Green Lake's daily rhythms began to change. Businesses that typically stayed open until 9 or 10 p.m. closed their doors by 6 p.m. Parents who once allowed their children to walk to school or play at the park began driving them everywhere and keeping them indoors after dusk. Local jogging paths and hiking trails, once buzzing with activity, turned eerily empty. Even community institutions like the church and the local library saw changes. Congregations that once gathered for evening services now opted for daylight hours, and the library installed security cameras after Sarah Carlisle's death, a grim but necessary precaution. Green Lake's residents adapted quickly, trading their casual habits for something harder, warier, more guarded: partnerships and patrols. Fearing for their loved ones, many families banded together to share the burden of protection. Fathers and older brothers began forming informal neighborhood watch groups, taking turns patrolling the streets and keeping an eye on anything out of the ordinary. Armed with flashlights and phones, they walked roads and alleyways in small groups, though their presence was more a deterrent than a match for a predator as evasive as the Green Lake Killer. However, these patches of collective effort came with an inevitable underside: accusations. It wasn't long before neighbors and friends began turning their suspicion on one another. In a town where everyone knew everyone else, the anonymity of the killer baffled and terrified them. Rumors spread about certain odd individuals. Maybe it was the reclusive man who lived near the edge of the woods, or perhaps it was the newcomer in town, the one with the vague backstory. That paranoia created fractures, transforming what was once a united community into one swimming in distrust. The burgeoning gun culture Green Lake also saw another development: an unprecedented surge in gun ownership. Local gun shops experienced record sales in those tense months as residents clamored for whatever weaponry they could legally acquire. While most Green Lake citizens had always viewed guns as tools for hunting rather than personal defense, that mindset began to shift. People felt a new urgency to take protection into their own hands. For some, like retired veteran Walter McKinley, this felt like a return to a bygone era. "It used to be we didn't need to worry," McKinley told a reporter. "Now I won't even go to check the mail without my old revolver at my side. It's not fear, it's preparation." But for others, these measures represented the deepening sense that their town was becoming unrecognizable, slipping further and further into paranoia. Collaboration with law enforcement local authorities weren't blind to the escalating fear or the social measures springing up across Green Lake. They worked actively to channel it toward productivity. The sheriff's department held community safety seminars at the high school gym, teaching practical measures like improving home security, avoiding walking alone at night, and reporting any suspicious activity. For the most part, these seminars were well received, though some residents expressed frustration. "We don't need tips on locking our doors," one woman said during a public quanda. "We need results. We need the person responsible sitting behind bars." The mounting pressure on the small-town police force was enormous, and even with FBI support, the lack of tangible leads turned every reassurance from law enforcement into an empty promise. a town on high alert. Perhaps the most pronounced effect of the fear gripping Green Lake was the sheer vigilance of its citizens. The once blissfully unaware town now operated like a community on high alert at all times. Porch lights stayed on in near-perpetual fashion, lighting up the streets at night like beacons of warning. Corner stores and diners installed security cameras, something that previously would have been considered unnecessary and alarmist. Parents coached their children on how to spot danger or talk to strangers, or more accurately, how not to talk to them. Women stopped traveling anywhere alone, often coordinating groups to shop for groceries, walk to their cars after work, or even attend social gatherings. The freedom they once enjoyed had disintegrated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of caution. Even small gestures changed. A passing jogger who nodded good morning might now be met with a narrow-eyed glare instead of a wave. Door-to-door salesmen and delivery workers found themselves questioned and turned away. It wasn't personal, it was survival, the national spotlight. Unsurprisingly, the Green Lake murders also attracted national media attention. Reporters turned up in droves, their shiny black vans parked along Main Street, their satellite dishes aimed at distant studios. For the first time in the town's history, Green Lake became a name known across the country, not for its maple groves or harvest festivals, but as a place where evil thrived. For some in Green Lake, the media presence offered a strange comfort, as though the scrutiny alone might ward off further violence. However, others felt exposed, uncomfortable with the way their private grief and fear had been turned into talking points for TV segments. "It feels like vultures circling," complained Julie Sanders, owner of a vintage clothing shop on Maple Lane. "It's like they're waiting for the next death just to keep their story alive." The waiting game. Despite their precautions, there was a pervading sense of helplessness in Green Lake. Families could install cameras, carry pepper spray, and avoid walking alone after sunset, but everyone knew the killer could strike again at any time. The Green Lake Killer had shown that he could take lives almost effortlessly, without leaving behind the kind of evidence that typically unraveled cases like these. And so, the once vivid community of Green Lake transformed into something bleak. Fear was no longer an occasional feeling, it was a constant undercurrent. And as families sat in their homes, lights burning into the night, they wondered a heartbreaking truth: whose loved one would be next? The Pursuit, a journey to unmask the killer. For nearly a year, Green Lake's law enforcement and the FBI had been chasing shadows. Each gruesome murder painted a picture of a killer who was methodical, careful, and maddeningly elusive. Every lead fizzled out, every suspect was cleared, and with each passing month, the Green Lake Killer seemed to gain confidence, as if mocking the very people who were trying to hunt him down. The turning point in the investigation came after Sarah Klin, the survivor who miraculously escaped the killer, provided law enforcement with the first tangible piece of evidence: a description. A tall male, likely in his late teens or early 20s, wearing what looked like a high school sports jacket. For the first time, the investigative team had something to work with: a potential profile of their suspect. The profile of the predator. Based on Sarah Klin's testimony and input from FBI profilers, the killer was identified as likely being someone from the local community, perhaps a young man who blended into the fabric of Green Lake life. He wasn't an outsider or a drifter, the killer knew the area too well. The isolated locations, the ease with which he carried out his crimes, the lack of significant mistakes, it all pointed to someone who lived right among them. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit speculated he was between 16 and 24 years old, intelligent but socially awkward. There was an eerie precision to the staging of the victims' bodies, suggesting someone with a compulsive need for control, who may have developed violent fantasies over years of abuse, neglect, or trauma. Each escalating crime was not an act of rage but a calculated and deliberate performance. "These aren't crimes of passion," one profiler explained during a briefing. "This is someone rehearsing their power. Someone who thrives on the fear they create." The investigators also believed the killer likely had boundaries, rules in a sense, which kept him from targeting victims indiscriminately. While all his victims thus far had been young women, there was no evidence that they were connected to him personally. He didn't stalk them for weeks or choose victims who had wronged him. His choices appeared random. Still, this cold detachment made him far more dangerous. He killed not for revenge, but for the sheer act itself. Canvassing the schools and athletic programs. Using Sarah's description of the high school sports jacket, the investigation turned its focus to local schools. Teams of officers and FBI agents visited Green Lake High and neighboring schools, questioning faculty, coaches, and administrators about male students or alumni matching the killer's profile. This was a painstaking process, and at first it yielded little. Several young men initially drew suspicion: a quiet dropout who had once been caught trespassing into the girls' locker room, an 18-year-old accused of aggressive behavior during football games, and a student who had once vandalized a home wearing a hoodie similar to Sarah's description. But none of them could be tied to the crimes. They either had strong alibis, lacked the physical characteristics Sarah recalled, or failed to display the high level of planning and intelligence evident in the murders. The dead ends began to weigh heavily on the task force, and tensions ran high. "Every time we thought we were getting close, the trail would just disappear," said Sheriff Peter Harlow in an interview years later. "We were fighting a killer who was smart, but even worse, he was patient." The unexpected break. A pattern emerges. Weeks after the investigation shifted its focus to schools, an officer assigned to sort through the overwhelming influx of public tips noticed something chilling. In almost every case, locals reported seeing a young man on or near the scene of past murders around the estimated times of death. The descriptions varied slightly. Some said the man looked athletic, others recalled a quiet demeanor, but a pattern began forming when the details were pieced together. The breakthrough came when a tip from a high school art teacher added a major clue. She recalled a student named Ethan Blake, a quiet but unsettlingly intense sophomore, who had once submitted a series of dark, macabre drawings in her class. One in particular had stuck with her, a charcoal sketch of a wooded clearing, eerily similar to where one of the victims had been found. Ethan had withdrawn from school shortly after the first murder, citing family issues. No one had thought much of it at the time, but, with hindsight, it became impossible to ignore. "When I saw the news about the killer's staging of bodies, I couldn't shake the feeling," the teacher confessed to investigators. "It reminded me of Ethan." Closing in on Ethan Blake. With a name to investigate, law enforcement began surveilling Ethan Blake, who was just 16 years old. He lived on the outskirts of Green Lake in a dilapidated ranch-style house with his father, a man known for his alcohol abuse and periodic violent outbursts. Records revealed a troubled history. Ethan's parents had divorced when he was 12, and his father had had multiple run-ins with Child Protective Services, though no charges were ever filed. Neighbors described Ethan as a loner, someone who rarely spoke but was often seen wandering the woods behind his home. "He gave me the creeps," admitted one neighbor. "There was just something about the way he carried himself, like he was always watching." Police soon obtained a warrant to search the Blake residence. What they found inside confirmed their worst fears. Ethan's room was a disturbing shrine to his crimes. They discovered newspaper clippings of the murders, articles meticulously highlighted and pasted in sequence on the walls. There were notes and sketches detailing the locations of each victim. Among the evidence was Sarah Clynn's shattered driver's side window glass, which Ethan had kept as a souvenir of his failed attempt to kill her. The most damning piece of evidence, however, was a bloody scrap of fabric that matched the clothing of Lisa Donahue, his third victim. Forensic analysis would later reveal DNA evidence directly tying Ethan to two of the murders. It was undeniable. The Green Lake killer had been unmasked. The dramatic arrest. On the morning of April 12, 1998, law enforcement descended on Ethan's home. SWAT teams surrounded the property while officers carefully approached the door. Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table when they entered, eating breakfast as though the chaos outside didn't exist. He didn't resist as they cuffed him, nor did he speak a single word during the arrest. His calm demeanor stunned the officers, an eerie reflection of the killer's steady, calculated persona. For Green Lake, the arrest of Ethan Blake marked the beginning of the end of a nightmare that had gripped the town for over a year. The killer had been hiding in plain sight, a local boy who blended seamlessly into the quiet community. But amid the relief was a grim sense of unease. How could such evil exist so close to home? How had no one seen the warning signs? Family shadows. The spark of a killer's rage. As the story of Ethan Blake's arrest rippled through Green Lake and beyond, the gruesome physical evidence of his crimes painted only part of the picture. To truly understand how a boy from a small, close-knit town could evolve into a calculated and remorseless serial killer, investigators and psychologists alike turned their focus to Ethan's past, a dark and fractured family history rife with pain and neglect. It soon became clear that the seeds of his violence had been sown long before his crimes began. Ethan's upbringing was marked by profound dysfunction and trauma. Born in 1982, Ethan Blake was the only child of Marcy and Dale Blake, a couple whose volatile relationship shaped the psychological landscape of their son's early years. Marcy was described by neighbors as kind but deeply naive, a woman who often kept to herself and seemed reluctant to stand up to her husband, whose temper and drinking habits were well known around town. Dale, on the other hand, was remembered as a rough-edged construction worker who was known for his quick fists and harsh words, a childhood of conflict. Ethan grew up in the shadow of his parents' toxic marriage, one filled with loud, explosive arguments that often spilled out onto the front porch of their shabby home. You heard the shouting from down the street, one former neighbor recalled. Sometimes it was just yelling about money, or him being too drunk, but other times you'd hear stuff breaking. It was ugly. By the time Ethan turned 10, Marcy and Dale's fights had escalated to the point that police were called to their home multiple times, though no serious charges were ever filed. The tension at home left young Ethan isolated and withdrawn. Teachers at his elementary school often described him as timid and quiet, a boy who rarely raised his hand in class and seemed reluctant to engage with his peers. However, beneath the surface were troubling signs of deep emotional turmoil. One teacher recalled catching Ethan tearing apart his notebook one afternoon in what appeared to be a fit of frustration. "He wasn't angry or anything," she recounted. "It was like he didn't know how to process what he was feeling." By the time Ethan reached middle school, the pressures of his home life reached a devastating breaking point. Marcy filed for divorce from Dale when Ethan was 12 years old. It wasn't a clean break, far from it. After years of enduring her husband's aggression, Marcy finally packed a single suitcase and left Green Lake without telling a soul. She didn't even take Ethan with her. Her sudden departure was as devastating as it was confusing for her young son, who was left to live solely in the care of his abusive father. For Ethan, his mother's abandonment felt like the ultimate betrayal. Though their relationship may not have been perfect, Marcy had been his primary source of stability in a deeply unstable environment. Her departure fueled a deep-seated resentment that he would carry with him long into adulthood. Investigators would later find a tattered photograph of Marcy in Ethan's room, her face scratched out with violent scribbles of ink. The influence of an abusive father. After Marcy left, Dale Blake became the sole custodian of Ethan's development, a responsibility he was ill-equipped to handle. Dale's drinking worsened, and with no one to temper his rage, he frequently turned his frustrations onto his son. Ethan endured years of verbal and occasional physical abuse, creating a toxic environment that fed his feelings of anger, worthlessness, and abandonment. Neighbors began to notice a change in Ethan during these years. Gone was the quiet, shy boy from elementary school. In his place was a withdrawn yet simmering young man whose interactions with others were often marked by subtle hostility or detachment. "You'd wave to Ethan and he'd just stare at you," one neighbor explained. "Nothing angry, just blank, like there was nothing going on inside." Ethan's adolescent years were equally troubling. Dale's parenting strategy largely consisted of indifference, punctuated by sporadic bursts of controlling rage. He had little regard for Ethan's academic performance or well-being and seemed more interested in ensuring he had someone to berate after a long shift at the construction yard. The lack of structure in Ethan's life meant he spent most of his time alone, wandering the woods behind their home or locking himself in his room to sketch, read, or play out violent fantasies he'd started to develop as an outlet for his frustrations. Psychologists who later analyzed Ethan's behavior suggested that Dale's abusive nature reinforced Ethan's already fragile understanding of relationships, further embedding the belief that control and violence were the only paths to power or respect. By the time Ethan dropped out of high school at 16, he had become a social ghost. Warning signs everyone missed. The years following Ethan's departure from school were littered with troubling incidents that, while chilling in hindsight, were brushed off by those who noticed them at the time. He was spotted on multiple occasions prowling the woods late at night, sometimes carrying tools like a hammer or rope. He would trespass into neighbors' backyards and linger there, seemingly without motive. On one occasion, a local woman found Ethan standing in the alley behind her house, staring at her kitchen window when she turned the lights on. He disappeared before she could call the police. Ethan's artwork also grew darker and more disturbing during this time. Sketchbooks filled with images of women in distress, bodies in unnatural positions, and shadowy, foreboding landscapes were found strewn about his room after his arrest. His teachers and peers had noted the twisted nature of his drawings years prior, but given Ethan's reclusive personality, most assumed he was simply an eccentric loner, not dangerous. Perhaps the most chilling discovery came from Ethan's personal journals. These weren't merely diaries but detailed chronicles of his anger toward his mother, whom he referred to as the beginning of everything wrong. In several entries, Ethan fantasized about scenarios where he confronted her, punished her, and even killed her. Psychologists later explained that much of his rage toward his victims may have been a substitute for the mother who abandoned him. A cycle that could have been broken. As investigators pieced together Ethan's history, one question began to surface repeatedly. Could this have been prevented? Some experts believed the warning signs were all there: his deteriorating behavior, obsession with violent imagery, and increasingly odd social interactions. However, a system ill-equipped to address the mental health of troubled teens, combined with the community's tendency to dismiss strange individuals as harmless, meant that Ethan slipped through the cracks. Ultimately, Ethan's crimes reflected the culmination of years of unchecked psychological damage. Trapped in an environment where love and support were absent and violence and control reigned, Ethan grew into a person who sought power in the most horrific ways. While his actions were his own choice, there's no denying they were shaped by the toxic influences he endured. Ethan's shocking confession. When Ethan Blake was arrested on the morning of April 12, 1998, he offered no resistance. He didn't run, he didn't lie, he didn't even attempt to justify himself. Instead, as law enforcement officers escorted him into an interrogation room deep in the Green Lake police station, Ethan did something that would leave even the most seasoned detective speechless. He confessed. But this wasn't a confession born out of guilt or remorse. Ethan's words were cold, clinical, and disturbingly devoid of emotion, as though he were describing events that had happened to someone else, not crimes he had meticulously carried out with his own hands. Over hours of questioning, Ethan unraveled the details of his crimes in a manner so chilling that even hardened FBI agents struggled to sit through his admissions without recoiling. "I had to do it." The first words that Ethan spoke during his confession, delivered with an unnerving detachment, were, "I had to do it." When detectives pressed him on what he meant, Ethan began to outline the deeply personal yet disturbingly twisted motives that had driven his killing spree. Ethan revealed that his crimes stemmed from what he described as an uncontrollable rage toward women, a hatred he traced back to his own mother, Marcy Blake. "When she left, everything got worse," Ethan said in a monotone voice, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. "She chose herself over me. She didn't care about me. She only cared about how free she could be when she walked out that door." Detectives and psychologists present during the interrogation would later describe Ethan's tone as devoid of humanity. He didn't cry. His voice didn't crack under the weight of his words. Instead, he spoke with the cold precision of someone dissecting their own darkness, almost as if his crimes were mathematical equations rather than horrific acts of violence. Ethan admitted that each victim he chose was, in his mind, a proxy for his mother. Though he didn't know these women personally, they carried traits that reminded him, however vaguely, of Marcy: kindness, vibrance, independence. "I wasn't looking for her, not for her face," he said, "but I could see pieces of her everywhere, in their smiles, the way they acted like they didn't need anyone. That's why I picked them." A calculated killing spree. Ethan did not stumble into his crimes. His confession painted a grim picture of methodical planning where each horrific act was part of a larger ritual of control. He stalked his victims for days, carefully observing their routines, where they worked and when they were most vulnerable. He described spending long hours walking through Green Lake's forests, memorizing trails and secluded spots, the locations that would eventually become the final resting places for women like Emily Carter and Sarah Carlisle. "I knew when they'd be alone," Ethan confessed, his voice eerily calm. "It wasn't hard to figure out. People trust this town too much. They don't think someone's watching them. But I was always watching." He explained the disturbing acts of staging his victims' bodies after their deaths, confirming what investigators had feared, that the arrangement of the remains was deliberate. Ethan spoke of it as though it were an art form, a way of expressing himself in the only way he knew how. "People don't listen to you so you make them look," he said at one point, his words chilling the room. For Ethan, the killings weren't simply about the act of taking life. They were about control over others, control over his simmering rage, and a deep, misplaced attempt to correct the sense of powerlessness he had felt his entire life. "When they saw what happened, people finally understood that there's someone stronger out there," Ethan said. The attack on Sarah Klin. One of the most haunting parts of Ethan's confession came when detectives asked him about Sarah Klin, the survivor who had escaped his attack. At first Ethan was reluctant to talk, not out of shame, but because his failure frustrated him. She was supposed to stay down. I handled everything right, but she didn't play her part. She wasn't supposed to run, Ethan said, his voice momentarily tinged with irritation. He described how he had been following Sarah for weeks, targeting her because of her seemingly cheerful demeanor. She smiled too much, Ethan said flatly. It reminded me of someone who thought everything was fine in the world. She probably thought nothing bad could ever happen to her. In chilling detail, Ethan described how he had planned to kill Sarah that night, smashing her car window and dragging her into the woods, but he hadn't anticipated her fight. She was stronger than I thought, he admitted, with a smirk that unsettled everyone in the room. She didn't stop moving and I lost her. That never happened before. Detectives later said Ethan appeared almost fascinated by Sarah's ability to escape. To him it was not a failure but a deviation from his carefully orchestrated game, one he strangely seemed to admire. No remorse, no regret. Perhaps the most horrifying aspect of Ethan Blake's confession was the complete lack of remorse he displayed for his crimes. When asked if he felt any guilt for what he had done, Ethan seemed genuinely puzzled by the question. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing, and asked, "Why would I?" Ethan saw his actions not as crimes but as expressions of what he believed to be his truth. "I did what I had to do," he said repeatedly, as though it were a mantra. In his broken mind, his victims weren't people. They were symbols for everything he hated, every slight and abandonment he had experienced throughout his life. A haunting close. When asked if he would have killed again, given the chance, Ethan didn't hesitate. His answer was short, final, and chilling. Yes. He even admitted that part of him enjoyed the cat-and-mouse game with police, and the sense of fear that gripped Green Lake during his reign of terror. They were all scared, and for the first time they weren't in control. I was. That's how it's supposed to be. By the end of his confession, there wasn't an ounce of humanity left in the picture Ethan Blake had painted of himself. He was calculating, cold-blooded, and entirely consumed by his anger and hatred. For Green Lake, hearing the details of Ethan's testimony brought a grim sense of closure, but also left the community grappling with an unnerving truth. Someone so evil had grown up among them, hidden in plain sight. Mental instability and societal failures. Ethan Blake's killing spree was monstrous. His methods were calculated and his confession was chillingly devoid of remorse. Yet, as investigators, psychologists, and the public at large sought to unravel the origins of his darkness, one uncomfortable truth emerged. Ethan Blake was not simply a monster born in isolation. His gruesome acts were a manifestation of deep-rooted mental instability, compounded by societal indifference, systemic failures, and a community that missed or ignored the warning signs. A portrait of a disturbed mind. Psychologists were quick to diagnose Ethan with several alarming conditions, none of which had been addressed during his formative years. He exhibited traits of antisocial personality disorder, which manifested in his lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and inability to bond with others. There were also indications of narcissistic tendencies, evidenced by his thirst for control and his belief that his victims were mere tools for his self-expression. At the root of Ethan's psychological state, however, was a profound abandonment wound. The departure of his mother, Marcy Blake, during a critical stage of his childhood left him with unresolved feelings of betrayal and rage. Experts identified this as the central psychological conflict shaping his actions, a displaced anger that he later directed at his victims, whom he chose because they reminded him of what his mother took from him. His obsession with recreating this dynamic, of punishing women to correct his feelings of powerlessness, illustrated how his early trauma had metastasized into violent psychopathy. He wasn't born a killer, one forensic psychologist noted. He was forged. You look at his upbringing, the lack of nurturing, the constant exposure to abuse and neglect, and you can see why his mental stability fractured so severely. The need for control and chaos. Ethan's need to meticulously plan his crimes, stage his victims, and relive his acts through trophies and journals pointed to one dominant psychological truth: control. In his shattered psychological world, control was the one thing Ethan had always lacked, be it over his chaotic home environment or his feelings of abandonment. The killings became his way of asserting that control, of proving to himself that he held power over life and death. But what stands out most in Ethan's case isn't merely his desire to kill, it's the absence of any ability to distinguish between right and wrong, a cognitive void created by years of emotional isolation and unchecked mental decline. His inability to empathize or recognize the moral gravity of his actions was not just chilling, it was symptomatic of a broken mind that society had failed to heal. A system that failed him. As horrifying as Ethan's crimes were, they also highlighted a system fundamentally ill-equipped to deal with troubled children and adolescents like him. From his early years in school to his troubled teenage isolation, every institution that came into contact with Ethan missed critical opportunities to intervene. Teachers described Ethan as withdrawn and quiet, but red flags, his bizarre artwork, emotional outbursts, and lack of socialization, were routinely brushed off as eccentricities, rather than early signs of a deeper problem. "I just thought he was a shy kid who liked drawing dark stuff to express himself," one teacher later admitted. "Sure, it was weird, but plenty of kids go through those phases. I didn't think it was a cry for help." Similarly, his neighborhood observed his growing detachment with hesitation, but failed to act. When Ethan was spotted lurking in backyards or wandering the woods late at night, residents merely dismissed it as odd behavior, chalking it up to him being a loner. None of them thought to report him or push for psychological attention, even though his patterns became increasingly alarming. The lack of meaningful guidance or mental health resources in Green Lake also played a role. As a small, close-knit community, Green Lake prided itself on solving problems internally, with families or churches addressing crises rather than involving outside professionals. But Ethan grew up in a household where those resources were non-existent. His father, Dale Blake, was an abusive alcoholic who lacked the emotional capacity to recognize his son's struggles, let alone address them with professional help. If someone had stepped in, sat this kid down, and taken the time to look into his mental health, one child psychologist later remarked, this entire tragedy could have been avoided, but no one did. He was invisible until it was too late. The taboo around mental health. Wider societal attitudes toward mental health also contributed to the tragedy. In the 1980s and 1990s, mental health awareness was still a stigmatized topic in communities like Green Lake. There was little understanding or willingness to grasp the complexities of adolescent mental health, especially when it manifested in unusual or socially disruptive ways. For many families, including the Blakes, seeking therapy or psychiatric help was associated with shame or weakness, something to avoid at all costs. Dale Blake exemplified this mindset. When Ethan's middle school counselor recommended he see a child psychologist following an incident in which Ethan destroyed classroom property, Dale vehemently refused. "There's nothing wrong with my son," he reportedly told the counselor. "We don't need some quack putting ideas in his head." The consequences of such attitudes became painfully clear as Ethan's mental state continued to deteriorate. Left untreated, his growing feelings of resentment, detachment, and frustration festered into something lethal. The cracks in the system. Ethan's case drew national attention not only for the gruesome nature of his crimes but also for what it revealed about the systemic failures that allowed him to slip through the cracks. Schools lacked the resources to properly identify and address his mental health needs. The mental health stigma in his community discouraged interventions, and even when warning signs surfaced, there was no cohesive effort to piece together the troubling pattern of behavior that culminated in his killings. If we had the resources we have now, mental health screenings, mandatory counseling for at-risk youth, I truly believe we could have prevented what happened, said Sheriff Peter Harlow in an interview years later. But back then, we just didn't know. We didn't have the tools, the training, or the awareness to process what we were seeing. A lesson in prevention. Ethan Blake's killing spree wasn't just a crime, it was a symptom of deeper societal failures. His case served as a grim reminder of the importance of addressing mental health issues early, especially in children and adolescents showing signs of emotional distress. Programs emphasizing early intervention, community awareness, and destigmatizing therapy have since become part of broader conversations about how to prevent future tragedies. For Green Lake, the lesson came at an unbearable cost. "We failed him," one resident said at a town meeting years after the killings. "But more than that, we failed the women he murdered. By ignoring him, we gave him the space to become the monster that took their lives." Law and controversy. The sentencing debate. When Ethan Blake was brought to trial in the summer of 1998, the courtroom became not only the stage for his prosecution but also the battleground for a deeply polarizing legal and moral debate. The brutal nature of his crimes sharply contrasted with the legal protections afforded to him due to his age, 16 at the time of his arrest. The trial's outcome, which resulted in a sentence of only 20 years in prison, drew outrage from the families of his victims and the broader Green Lake community. They felt betrayed by a system they once believed delivered fair and just consequences. What echoed in public discourse was not just anger at Ethan's light punishment, but a broader conversation about the ethics of sentencing juveniles for violent crimes, the role of mental health in criminal justice, and whether the law aligned with the public's demand for moral clarity. The juvenile justice dilemma. One of the most contentious aspects of the trial was that Ethan was tried as a juvenile, despite the severity and premeditated nature of his crimes. In 1998, Michigan's laws did allow for minors to be tried as adults for violent felonies, including murder. However, defense attorneys argued that Ethan's deeply troubled upbringing and severe mental health issues warranted leniency, and they successfully petitioned for his case to remain in the juvenile court system. Their argument was simple. Ethan Blake, though capable of horrific violence, was legally a child. He was a minor who had been shaped by years of emotional trauma, unchecked abuse, and neglect. Defense lawyers presented a narrative of a boy failed by everyone around him, a mother who abandoned him, a father who brutalized him, a school system that ignored glaring red flags, and a community that turned a blind eye. This is not just a case of legal accountability, argued Ethan's lead defense attorney in his opening statement. This is the story of a child left to fend for himself in a darkness no one cared to pull him out of. We must hold him responsible, yes, but let's not forget that we created this monster. The defense attorneys also cited brain development studies that suggested young people lack the ability to fully understand the long-term consequences of their actions. They argued that punishing Ethan with life imprisonment or the death penalty, which many Green Lake residents had called for, would ignore any possibility of rehabilitation. The prosecution's argument. The prosecution, however, painted a very different picture of Ethan Blake. To them, he was not a lost child, but a calculated predator who had exhibited a chilling lack of empathy and a meticulous desire for control over his victims. Prosecutors emphasized the deliberate planning of his crimes, his stalking of victims, the selection of secluded locations, the staging of his victims' bodies, and his nonchalant confession, which displayed no remorse. This was not a child acting on impulse, said the lead prosecutor. This was a methodical, cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what he was doing. If we allow his age to shield him from the consequences of these heinous acts, we are sending the wrong message, not just to this community, but to every future victim. They pressed hard to try him as an adult, arguing that his crimes went beyond the scope of juvenile recklessness. They also brought family members of the victims to the stand to deliver emotional testimonies, forcing the jury to confront the devastating impact of Ethan's violence. "I lost my daughter," said Emily Carter's mother, her voice trembling with grief. "She was 22 years old, she had her entire life ahead of her, and she died in fear, alone in the woods, because this boy, this man, decided she didn't deserve to live. How can you call that a child's mistake?" The sentence. A decision. Dividing a town in the end, the decision not to try Ethan as an adult was based largely on legal precedent and the judge's understanding of juvenile justice principles. Ethan was sentenced to 20 years in a juvenile detention facility, with the possibility of early parole depending on his behavior and psychological progress. This meant he could potentially be a free man by the age of 36. For the families of the victims, the sentence was a gut-wrenching blow. Many spoke out angrily at the hearing and later in interviews. 20 years isn't justice," said the father of Sarah Carlisle, sobbing as he left the courtroom. "It's a slap in the face to my daughter and to every other family who lost someone to this monster. He planned to kill, he enjoyed killing, and now he gets to walk free while we have to live with this pain for the rest of our lives." Outside the courthouse, Green Lake residents organized protests, demanding reforms to the state's policies on juvenile offenders. Hand-painted signs reading "Justice for the Victims" and "A Killer, Not a Child" filled the streets. Tensions in the small community were so high that police were stationed to keep the peace during the emotionally charged aftermath of the sentencing. The debate over rehabilitation. Ethan's sentencing reignited a broader national conversation about juvenile sentencing, rehabilitation, and the ability of violent young offenders to change. Advocates for rehabilitation argued that the sentence gave Ethan a chance to reform, to address his mental health, and to one day integrate back into society. They cited programs that had successfully turned around the lives of troubled minors, even those convicted of violent crimes. "Ethan is a product of trauma," said a criminal psychologist who testified on the defense's behalf. "If we fail to address the root causes of his violence in a controlled environment, we risk producing an even greater danger to society, but if given the right treatment, there is hope." Critics of the sentence, however, were unconvinced. They argued that Ethan's crimes, carefully calculated and executed without remorse, suggested a personality incapable of meaningful change. Many believed that allowing him the potential of early release put society at risk. Rehabilitation works for some, one critic stated in a televised debate, but let's not fool ourselves. This boy is not an ordinary case of bad choices. He is a serial murderer who thrived on control and violence. What evidence do we have that counseling or therapy could strip that darkness from him? A community split. The 20-year sentence left Green Lake deeply divided. Some residents supported the decision, believing Ethan's reformation could serve as a symbol of societal progress. Others condemned it, seeing it as a travesty of justice that devalued the lives of the victims. Over time, the case even became a touchstone for political movements. Advocacy groups formed around the country, either to advocate for harsher penalties for juvenile offenders or to push for greater investment in mental health services to prevent such tragedies in the first place. Lingering questions. Ethan Blake's sentencing left behind questions that nagged at the conscience of Green Lake. How should society treat young killers? Is justice about punishment, or is it about the chance for redemption? Were Ethan's crimes the fault of a broken system, or did humanity simply fail to stop an evil it couldn't foresee? One thing was certain, though: while the legal process had finished, the wounds left by Ethan Blake's actions were far from healed. For Green Lake, the sentence was not closure. It was the beginning of a long journey toward understanding justice in an imperfect world. A society awakened. Tough lessons from tragedy. The case of Ethan Blake left a scar on Green Lake, but its repercussions reached far beyond the boundaries of the small town. Across the nation, people began to examine the case not just for its horror, but for what it revealed about deep societal failings. It wasn't just the story of one young man's descent into violence. It was a cautionary tale about negligence, untreated trauma, and the consequences of turning a blind eye to the vulnerable and disturbed in our communities. Ethan Blake wasn't born a killer. Every step of his life, from his chaotic childhood to his encounters with a society reluctant to take mental health seriously, contributed to shaping him into one. His killings were horrific, but they reflected more than just individual evil. They exposed the cracks in a system that failed to identify, understand, or treat the darkness growing within him. This realization became a wake-up call for society, forcing communities, lawmakers, and professionals to grapple with tough questions. How can we prevent tragedies like this? What do we owe the troubled and the vulnerable among us? How much responsibility does society bear for its monsters? Missed warning signs, a collective failing. The haunting truth about Ethan's case was that so many people around him had seen warning signs, and yet nothing was done to intervene. His teachers noticed his isolation and disturbing art but dismissed it as harmless creativity. His neighbors saw his odd behavior, the way he skulked through the woods at night or lingered in backyards, but they shrugged it off as teenage eccentricity. Even after his bouts of vandalism and outbursts in school, no serious effort was made to address the underlying issues. Forensic psychologists later broke down Ethan's behavior, pointing out that his path to violence didn't appear out of nowhere. It was a slow, visible unraveling that the people in his life either ignored or misunderstood. He didn't wake up one day and decide to kill, one psychologist explained in an interview after the trial. This was years in the making, and it wasn't invisible. The people around him saw the signs but lacked the tools to understand them or the courage to act. Green Lake, like many small communities, prided itself on its strong, close-knit culture. But in this case, that same culture may have been part of the problem. Neighbors didn't want to get involved in what they saw as someone else's problem. Schools sometimes lacked the resources or awareness to address troubled students deeply, and the stigma around mental health ensured that those cracks turned into chasms. Looking back, it's clear we failed him, said one of Ethan's former middle school teachers years later. We had this boy who was withdrawing more and more, whose behavior was screaming that something was wrong, and we just let him drift further into isolation. I'll always regret that. Mental health, a broken system. The Ethan Blake case also sparked nationwide scrutiny over how mental health was handled in the late 20th century. Communities like Green Lake reflected a troubling reality. Mental health care was still largely stigmatized and inaccessible, especially for children and teenagers. At the time, mental health issues were often seen as a sign of weakness or bad parenting, rather than a treatable issue that required professional intervention. Ethan's father, Dale Blake, refused to allow him access to therapy, describing it as nonsense, when a school counselor suggested it after Ethan began vandalizing school property. Dale's refusal wasn't uncommon for the era. Many families, especially in working-class communities, saw therapy as a luxury or even an insult, something reserved for the wealthy or those considered crazy. But society's broader indifference to mental health played an even larger role. Resources for troubled youth were severely underfunded. School counselors were often overwhelmed, unable to dedicate the time needed to intervene in serious cases like Ethan's. And even when red flags were apparent, there were few systems in place to connect children with the support they needed. The problem wasn't just that Ethan didn't get help, one child psychologist reflected during a televised discussion of the case. It was that the structures to offer that help barely existed. How many other Ethans were out there, quietly slipping through the cracks? The role of community in prevention. The killings in Green Lake also raised difficult but necessary questions about the responsibilities of communities in preventing tragedy. In hindsight, many Green Lake residents recognized that their reluctance to address Ethan's worsening behavior reflected a broader cultural failure. "We thought it wasn't our place," one neighbor admitted during a town hall meeting years later. "He wasn't our kid, it wasn't our business, we didn't think he was dangerous. But maybe if we'd stepped in, if we'd asked questions or called someone, things would have turned out differently." This realization spurred a movement in Green Lake to destigmatize getting involved in the lives of at-risk youth. Local churches, schools, and community centers began organizing programs to teach residents how to recognize and respond to warning signs of mental illness, abuse, or neglect. "Look, it's uncomfortable to confront these things," said Pastor Henry Morton, who led one such program. "No one wants to accuse their neighbor of being a bad parent, or to admit that a kid down the street might be dangerous. But it's more uncomfortable to live with the regret that you said nothing when you had the chance to protect someone." Legislative change and advocacy nationally, Ethan's case became a rallying cry for mental health advocacy and juvenile justice reform. Advocacy groups pointed to the tragedy as evidence of a broken system that prioritized punishment over prevention. Politicians introduced legislation to increase funding for school counseling programs, expand mental health screenings for minors, and ensure that families in crisis had access to affordable therapy. One of the most notable changes came in the form of legal requirements for mandatory reporting of concerning behavior in school settings. Teachers, administrators, and counselors were now obligated to flag students displaying severe emotional, psychological, or behavioral issues for further assessment. The case also spurred debates about red flag laws for minors, policies that would allow communities to intervene when individuals displayed patterns of concerning behavior that might escalate into violence. While not all of these proposals became law, Ethan's crimes ensured they became prominent parts of the national conversation. A society left reflecting. The most painful lesson from Ethan Blake's case was that it took a series of brutal murders to force Green Lake, and the broader world, to confront its failures. For the residents of Green Lake, it wasn't enough to acknowledge those failures, they had to grapple with the guilt of their inaction. Memorials for the victims often became places for quiet reflection, as people wondered if they had missed their chance to stop Ethan before it was too late. Beyond the grief, though, there was hope. Programs for early intervention began to take root across the country, and conversations about mental health entered the mainstream in ways they never had before. Green Lake became a symbol, not just of tragedy, but of the hard, messy, and necessary work of confronting the factors that allow tragedies to happen in the first place. Ethan Blake's crimes were a failure of one boy's mind, but also of everyone around him, a columnist for the New York Times wrote. If we let his story fade into the margins of history, we aren't just forgetting the women who lost their lives, we're inviting the next Ethan Blake into our communities. A resonating wake-up call. Ethan Blake's story is a haunting lesson that echoes far beyond the small town of Green Lake. His crimes weren't just a devastating aberration, they were a symbol, a reflection of how the gaps in society's care, awareness, and willingness to act can compound into tragedy. Each victim lost was a painful reminder that the systems designed to protect and nurture our most vulnerable often fail when their intervention is needed most. But while Ethan's story begins with senseless violence and missed opportunities, it ends as a clarion call for change, one that demands we address the foundations of the society we've constructed. For Green Lake, the wake-up call lingered, not just in the collective grief over the women murdered, but also in the deep sensations of guilt, regret, and frustration at what might have been. The tragedy of Ethan Blake shines a spotlight on society's blindness to early warning signs, the stigma surrounding mental health, and the consequences of failing to protect those who need it most, from victims to perpetrators. A mirror to our neglect. At its core, Ethan's case forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the way we treat struggling individuals, especially young boys growing up in toxic environments. From his chaotic family life to his unsettling behavior moving through adolescence, Ethan was crying out for intervention long before his crimes began. Yet, time and time again, the people and institutions around him overlooked what should have been glaring warnings. This was not limited to psychologists or educators. It extended to neighbors who avoided getting involved, teachers who dismissed his behavior as just another phase, and a community that considered his growing volatility as the hallmark of a troubled kid, rather than the development of a much darker pathology. Ethan carried his pain and anger like a gathering storm, visible to everyone and yet ignored. Communities like Green Lake, as much as they pride themselves on close-knit bonds and mutual care, often reflect a broader societal reluctance to take proactive steps when someone doesn't fit the mold. Questions go unasked, warning signs go unheeded, and those whose minds crack under the pressure of trauma are left unaided, building an internal darkness that eventually explodes outward. Ethan's descent wasn't quiet, one forensic psychologist noted during a televised panel about the case. His rage built piece by piece, visible in his isolation, his escalating behaviors, and his untreated trauma. The tragedy wasn't that it happened. The tragedy was that it was entirely preventable. The cost of inaction. The sorrow gripping Green Lake after Ethan's arrest wasn't just about the lives that had been taken. It was about the lingering what-ifs that consumed those who reflected on their own roles in allowing the tragedy to happen. What if a teacher had pushed harder for counseling after noticing Ethan's disconnection and disturbing artwork? What if a neighbor had reported him after seeing him lurking behind their house at night? What if someone, anyone, had advocated for Ethan when his father dismissed therapy or showed abusive tendencies? These questions weighed heavily on the town. Over time, the conversation expanded nationwide, as more people began to see Green Lake not merely as the backdrop of tragedy, but as a microcosm of deeply entrenched societal flaws. It became clear that Ethan's violence was the eruption of a much larger issue: how easily vulnerable individuals, especially youth, can slip through the cracks. "We failed him before he ever failed us," said Sheriff Peter Harlow in an interview years later. "That's the truth of it. We didn't reach out when it might have mattered. Society didn't give us the tools to intervene effectively. So those women paid the price for all of our failures, not just Ethan's." A call for mental health reform. Ethan's case became one of the most significant wake-up calls for mental health reform at the close of the 20th century. Across the nation, it opened a sobering dialogue about the deeply ingrained stigmas surrounding emotional and psychological care, particularly for children and adolescents. Historically, mental health struggles in children had been widely downplayed, misunderstood, or, worse, trivialized. Teachers, parents, and even medical professionals often dismissed symptoms of mental instability as moody behavior or teenage rebellion. There was little acknowledgement of how untreated trauma could metastasize into something far more dangerous. The Ethan Blake case demanded that society change how it approached mental health, particularly for at-risk youth. Bolstered by public outcry and growing advocacy, new programs began to address these gaps. Awareness campaigns pushed to destigmatize therapy and counseling. Schools introduced mandatory mental health training for teachers to help them identify early warning signs of emotional and psychological distress in students. Communities began establishing resource centers focused on early intervention for troubled children, with many states passing legislation requiring schools to provide access to mental health professionals. Ethan Blake was a product of a society that failed to catch him before it was too late, explained one advocate during a congressional hearing on mental health reform in schools. If we miss the chance to address these issues early, we aren't just failing individuals, we're putting entire communities at risk. The question of responsibility. Ethan's story not only exposed systemic failings, but also raised deeper questions about the moral responsibilities of individuals. While laws and programs can be crafted to prevent future tragedies, they rely on people willing to act. Ethan's neighbors, teachers, and community members often reflected, sometimes publicly, on how their silence had contributed to the violence. One Green Lake resident who lived near the Blake family admitted during a televised interview, I saw him out there in the woods a lot. There was something about the way he moved, always so quiet, watching everything, but I thought, he's just an odd kid, not my business. Thinking about that now, I should have made it my business. This collective soul-searching brought the harsh reality into focus. That societal change begins with individuals stepping up, asking questions, and treating odd behavior not as an inconvenience but as a signal for intervention. Many in Green Lake began advocating for fostering a culture of involvement, one where communities take action when someone shows signs of struggling instead of retreating into assumptions or apathy. The national ripple effect. While Green Lake bore the brunt of the tragedy, the impact of Ethan Blake's case reverberated nationwide. Advocacy groups sprang up in response, with some focusing on mental health reform and early intervention, while others lobbied for harsher penalties for juvenile offenders who commit violent crimes. Congress held multiple hearings about the state of juvenile justice and the need for increased funding for mental health initiatives. Perhaps one of the most significant outcomes was the establishment of better communication systems between schools, law enforcement, and mental health organizations. Too often, cases like Ethan's fell through the cracks because institutions operated in isolated silos without connecting the dots. New protocols for mandatory reporting and collaborative case management aimed to create nets that would catch troubled youth before they reached a breaking point. Hope through hard lessons. As painful as it was, the tragedy of Ethan Blake created an opportunity. It forced Green Lake and countless other communities to reckon with their failures and to begin the slow work of becoming better equipped, better informed, and better at taking action. Schools in Green Lake introduced emotional support programs and partnered with local mental health professionals to ensure students had the help they needed. Volunteers created mentorship networks to reach out to isolated, struggling youth, and families became more attuned to the mental health needs of their children, breaking cycles of denial and ignorance. "We'll never forget what happened," Pastor Henry Morton said during a gathering at a memorial for Ethan's victims, "but the best way to honor those lives is to make sure nothing like this ever happens again, not here, not anywhere." Looking to the future. Ethan Blake's case is no longer simply a story of a small-town tragedy. It has become a symbol of both the consequences of neglect and the power of reflection. As local and national leaders push forward with reforms, the story serves as a reminder that society's work is never done. Protecting the vulnerable, supporting the struggling, and addressing the brokenness in our systems isn't the job of one individual entity. It's a collective effort, one that requires constant vigilance and humanity. "As much as this hurts to say," wrote one journalist in the Washington Post, "Ethan Blake gave us a gift, a painful, bloody gift. He forced us to look at ourselves, our systems, and our communities, and he reminded us that if we continue to ignore the cracks, more lives will inevitably fall through."